All right. Thanks, everyone. Welcome to this Govern 365 webinar. Thanks for joining us. At Govern 365, we're focused on helping boards and leadership teams make governance practical. Today's topic goes right to the heart of that in terms of most boards spend a lot of time thinking about the formal parts of governance, the board pack, the agenda, the minutes, the committees, the papers, etc. Really, leadership and the team board is a key part of that. So often the real quality of governance sits underneath all of those, and it sits in the quality of the conversation. It sits in the relationship between the chair and the CEO. It sits in whether directors are willing to challenge well, whether management feel able to be honest, whether the board can surface the uncomfortable issues early, and whether discussions and decisions are genuinely tested before they're made. That's where governance can either be powerful or performative, because good decisions do not come just from good information. They come from trust, challenge, clarity, judgment, and the ability of a group of people to work well together under pressure. So today we're going to explore what sits beneath the boardroom decisions. How should the chair and CEO relationship really work? What does a healthy challenge look like? How do boards create psychological safety without becoming soft? And how do we make sure that the boardroom is not just a place where papers are received, but where the most important decisions are properly shaped, tested, and improved? I'm pleased to be joined by Mike Bennetts. Many of you will know Mike from Z Energy, being the CEO there, where he made a significant difference, taking the former Shell business and helping build Z into a distinctive New Zealand company with a strong brand, culture, and reputation. He led it for 12 years through transformation, growth, public listing, major transactions, COVID. Today, Mike works with CEOs, boards, and executive teams as a leadership expert, coach, and advisor. And what I really value about Mike, and I've had him at my CEO groups a couple of times, is that he has lived experience that he can share practically. He understands the pressure on CEOs, the importance of the chair-CEO relationship, the realities of board dynamics, and the leadership behaviours that either lift or limit an organisation. So Mike has previously described governance as being about strategy, the game we play and how we win, and risk management, while also being clear that governance is not about the board doing management's job. He's also spoken about the importance of directors using influence rather than authority, respecting different views, surfacing background conversations, and the chair acting more like a referee and a coach than simply another player. So welcome, Mike.
Kia ora, Gerry. Great to be here.
Excellent. I'd like to just take you've been both sides of the fence, if you like, CEO and chair. And I know you've done a lot of work around leadership, which is relevant to boards or leadership teams. So I'm interested in just your perspectives and what you've learned from that situation.
Yeah, so I've been in the role of director. Actually, that was my first director role. I was a chair in 1999, my first CEO job in 2003, and I'm still the chair of a venture capital fund at the moment. So yeah, we just say I've been on both sides of the table. I've been on both sides of the table for a long period of time. And so I've seen a lot of things change over the years. But also in the last 3 years, now that I'm working with boards, executives, chief executives, and leadership teams, I've also got a couple of insights that build on all of that experience that I just wouldn't mind sharing with you. That I think as much as we concentrate on, as you say, the quality of the papers, etc., I think a lot of boards and management, as enabled by the board, spend too much time at the level of what I would call action. And there are things that happen in boardrooms and in management groups that are upstream of action that I think are often somewhat invisible to the board. And yeah, I'm happy to explain where my thinking comes from. But I had, through the benefit of AI, been able to take 3 years worth of coaching and consulting work and get my AI to work with me to kind of figure out why do boards and executive teams keep repeating the same patterns of behavior, even though they know it doesn't work.
So can you explain a little bit more about that? You said above the level of action. Can you explain a bit more about your learnings and your model around that?
Yeah, sure. So it's a 5-layer causal model. In other words, the bottom layers, the downstream layers, are impacted or caused by what happens above it. So if I start at the bottom layer is results. And results are produced by action, the next layer. Actions are determined by context, how things show up for people, how people interpret things. Context is interpreted through identity, which is the story we have about ourselves, either as an individual, a team, a board, or indeed a company. And then commitment organizes identity. So the stack goes commitment, identity, context, actions, results. And what I call downstream is the actions and results level. So, typically with boards, when something's not going well, they intervene at the level of action. And what I'm learning through my own experience and those of the people I work with is often the invisible or the upstream layers of context, identity, and commitment are never examined. And therefore, there's only so many actions you take. So what I say to people that I work with is that if you executed 20% better, would this problem go away? Would the solution be there for you? And if the answer is yes, get on with it. If the answer is no, then I think you've got to go and start to think about those upstream layers, because there are just some times where we know that executing 20% better still doesn't solve the problem or close the gap or deliver the result that the board or the management team are committed to.
Can you give an example of, you've talked about, and I've seen this with teams where not delivering the results, so we'll throw more actions and push harder, and and still nothing changes other than overwhelming people. Can you give an example of where you've seen them go upstream and seen a change, and how they've gone about that?
Yeah, so I'd say a good example is COVID, actually, because I certainly, when I was a chief executive during COVID, so had plenty of people to talk with about that one. And a lot of business leaders or boards were saying to me, "Oh my God, I wish my team could execute as well as they did during COVID," which sounds kind of weird. Like, why do we need to have a crisis for the team to be executing well? And to me, that was an example of a couple of things. One was context. The context, or the way in which reality was being interpreted, was so damn obvious, like in some cases, like the company I used to be a part of, that if we don't sort things out quickly, we'll go broke because we've lost 80% of our revenues overnight. We have to find a way to keep our people safe. We have to find a way to be effective at working from home. So if you like, all of the interpretation about COVID, and I know that yes, some people were more threatened or scared by that than others, but generally the context was really clear. This is like a big thing. It's affecting the world. It affects our company, our customers, our employees. We've got to deal with it. Now, if you contrasted that with other times where companies are in, let's say, trouble or not executing well, or things aren't going their way, the clarity is just not there. So that's why you don't have people really leaning into the problems that are long standing. Why I think sometimes boards keep on asking management for more reports, perhaps rather than stepping back and saying, actually, how are we interpreting what's happening right now? How is this world showing up for us? And I just think certainly that first year of COVID, the context was really, really clear for most organizations, and therefore their teams executed beautifully. Yeah. So to me, that's a really compelling example where, now you don't want to create crises day in, day out, because that's absolutely draining. But the skill comes from being able to generate a context that's fully understood and mutually agreed, so you get the same response as if you were in something like COVID.
Yeah. Have you got any examples of where identity is at play from the board or leadership team that have impacted things?
Yeah, again, I'll stick with COVID just as an example. There would just be things that companies did during COVID that previously they might have related to as perhaps sacred cows. Like the working from home thing, I think is absolutely fabulous. There were lots of people who said, "Why can't we work from home?" And there were plenty of managers or boards who said, "That's not the way we do things around here, because we're concerned about productivity, culture leakage, etc." When COVID first caused that to happen, a lot of people started to see the benefits of that. I know in my own organization, there are a lot of people who are very, like from an identity perspective, the story they have about themselves was, I just can't work from home. I'm an extrovert. I'm in marketing. I need to interact with people. I'm highly collaborative, blah, blah, blah. And then when they have no choice but to work from home, they start to experience it like, actually, I have more time for deep thinking. I'm able to better manage my workload alongside the other things that happen in my life. to the extent that, after an extended period of time, some people's story about themselves was, I can't work in an office, which is why people didn't want to come back. So I think that, to me, is a really, really good example. I know that in Z we had a particular story about ourselves in terms of our commitment to customers. And when affordability really became an issue, there were things like the forecourt service. We said, we just can't afford to sustain this. Given that we've lost 80% of revenues, even when it comes back, it just seems that people don't want to have that interaction because customers are generally wary of human-to-human contact. So we took that as the opportunity to take away what was a really compelling piece of our offer back in 2011. We took it away in 2021. Now, to me, that was another example of any time that sacred cows get slayed is usually a good example of where people's story about themselves, the team, the company has been re-authored or rewritten.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And if I go back and think about your, times you've been a CEO and the relationship with the chair, what's, examples for you around critical things that need to happen for that to be a success, and the difference between when it's just polite and okay, but not necessarily adding as much value? What's the difference for you, or that you've experienced?
Yeah, there'd be two things. One is context. I'll come back to that theme again. Is that I think it's really important for the chair and CEO to be diverse in their thinking, to challenge one another, etc., etc. But I think it's equally really important that they have a fully understood and mutually agreed context. I.e., is the business in trouble right now? Is the business dying? Is the business challenged? Is the business being risk averse? Not to say like their view prevails, but I think the more they can get, to quote an old cliche, on the same page, the more that helps. Because I know that during my testing times with my experience as a chief executive, I know that it's always like if the chair and I are locked in with one another and we acknowledge that it's up to us to bring our respective teams to be working together, we've got to be clear on what it is that unites the two of us. So I'd say it's context and it's commitment to one another's success. So two C words: getting clear on the context and having a sufficiently mutual commitment. And then I think the other thing that, in my experience of when it's gone really well and then conversely not so well, is when the CEO and chair are really working together to create the conditions within which the board and management can work well together. And by conditions, that talks to things like you mentioned earlier, like psychological safety, where agendas are organized in such a way that you're both talking about the upside and the downside, where business cases are discussed evenly. I'll give an example that if management come along each time with a business case and all the board ever do is question the risks and the downside, the board are inadvertently training management to be conservative, risk averse, to the extent that ultimately business cases will not come forward because management will self-censor before it even gets into the boardroom. And it's not like I think boards have a plan to do that. I think that boards are directors that aren't even in their examination of business cases, like what are the risks, what are the downsides, where is there regret, how could we make this bigger, how could we accelerate it, what would it take to realize the prize in half the time. If it's too uneven either way, but it typically is uneven to the downside, then management, I think, unconsciously give up because they know they're going to get it feels like a kicking. I brought the business case in, we examined it to heck at a management level, and all the board did was focus on the downside.
Have you experienced that in your career where you've had a board that were like that and how it affected you?
Yes. Yeah, not like the board were like that all of the time, but things sometimes come in cycles. This is another example of identity. So if you took us, and I'll make it a hypothetical, that if you imagine a situation, and it's a hypothetical I've lived through, if you imagine a situation where share price is down, if you're a public company, investor confidence is down, frankly, it's damn hard for directors not to be affected by that, because they will go to networking events or they'll sit on other boards and they'll get a bit of chirp or chatter from investors or fellow directors like, what the hell are you guys at X doing? So I think directors are human beings. They can't help but bring that into the boardroom. So if they feel like things aren't going well for us as a company, and I'm getting that reinforced each time I'm in the outside world, I think they sub or unconsciously bring that into the boardroom. There's actually some really good research that says that public company or public markets condition companies to behave a particular way that's not necessarily healthy to the outcomes that investors want. Like, examining your performance every quarter if you're in America, half yearly if you're in New Zealand, creates a level of can be unhelpful. It's not to say there shouldn't be accountability, but depending on how the conversation goes, as I said, you are conditioning directors and management to being, defensive, or having a particular mindset around examination in a way that gets in the way of perhaps achieving bold ambitions.
And where have you seen drift in the relationship between the CEO and the chair? So where something, is not massively wrong, but, some red flags where it's drifting over time.
Yeah, I think where you take one another for granted is a good example of that. So when I mentioned earlier that you need to have a mutual commitment as chair and CEO, it's a little bit like, say, your marriage or your partnership you might have outside of work. I know that some people sort of roll their eyes when people or couples talk about we have to have date night so that we can keep our relationship alive in the face of lots of kids, lots of work and all that stuff. I think you've got to find your equivalent of date night between chair and CEO. Like, how do you keep the relationship alive? Particularly if you've been at it, for a while, and if you've got a CEO who's been there for say 5 to 10 years, and perhaps a chair that's been there for 3 to 6, you can start to take one another for granted. So I think that's one thing that you would do. I think equally when if you've got a capable CEO where the company's going well and performance is on track, I think that's in itself could be a form of drift, in that things actually could be better. So what's the opportunity cost of simply protecting or preserving the currently good momentum? What is that actually putting at risk around, or the opportunity cost of not having greater momentum? So I think that sometimes good performance or a well-established, well-performing CEO can be just as much of a challenge to the chair-CEO relationship as one who's not performing.
Yeah. The question here, so what suggestions does Mike have to get to know people, i.e. executives outside of formal board structures, not just with the CEO? So I'm assuming that comes from a board perspective. Directors sometimes a bit afraid of building relationships with executives because they feel like they're stepping on the CEO's toes.
Yeah, I think there's two parts of that. One is they might be stepping on the CEO's toes, but equally they might feel if I get to know management too well, I'll be trapped by their personality rather than their ideas or how they argue or present a case or do their risk management. So I think that's just part of being grown up. I think you can have relationships with people and still play your role. I think there's lots of ways in which board members or directors can do that. I personally had no problem with any director approaching anyone in Z at any point in time. And I didn't say go through me. I didn't say copy me. I just trusted that both the employee and the director would just be responsible around that. There were times where I went back to directors and said, hey, look, you may not realize it, but when you ask that way, or where you question that way, or where you intervene that way, here's how you leave people thinking and feeling. So I was responsible, if you like, in those times where they might have inadvertently created tension or drama. So I think, I think I'm very happy for directors to connect directly with people. I think that board meetings should be more than just the senior management walking in there and presenting stuff, particularly on health and safety. I know they're pretty well at every health and safety committee meeting we ever had at Z. Well, I won't say ever. We learned how to get better. So certainly from 2013, 14 onwards, we would have frontline workers come in and talk about risks. We wouldn't have a polished executive come in with a beautiful looking matrix and PowerPoint deck to talk about how we manage risk. So I think that enabled the board to directly experience how frontline manage things and give the frontline the confidence that the board are just human beings. It also provides the opportunity for the board to be a little bit more complementary or be in a more positive environment. Often boards and frontline workers sometimes only come together when something terrible has happened, like we've got an incident investigation. And I think the third most important way is actually for directors to get out in the business, like to be customers of the organisation, to be out there with frontline teams, whether it be operational teams or customer-facing teams, to sit in management forums. Imagine at Z, we often would work with the service station operators. We would have regular conferences, and we always invited directors to join all of the 2 or 3 day conference. And some of them just came along, say, for the jamboree type dinner on the second night. Others would sit there through the whole thing. Again, that was a great way, I think, to break down the mystique of the board. Because I think one of the things I'm reasonably hot on, it's the board's job to govern the company. It's the manager's job to manage the company. And as a chief executive, I know many people might relate to you like the boss and the board are your boss. Well, at one level, they are your boss, but equally they're not, right? Because there is a distinction between what CEOs do and what the board do. And I think it's sometimes good for the team to experience the CEO saying to the board, hey, that's really valuable advice. Thanks for the feedback, and I'm not going to do it. Because, as a CEO, there are often things that are your accountability and you get to take advice and then call it another way. And there are other times where the board say, do that. And you go, yes, I will, because that's very clearly, their call. That's their role as governors, as opposed to, the role of manager.
I think that's a really interesting point you made there around the roles of board and management. And I've heard from others around, there's no one rule around this is the board and this is the management, and it can again depend on the context and organisation. So, if I'm a new director coming onto a board, how do I figure out where that balance is and where that line is?
Yeah, well, there's 2 ways, and one's more instructive than the other. The first way is to read all the relevant documents. There's a board charter, there may be committee charters, there's what I call rules of engagement. There's all that stuff. And then there's all the unwritten rules about how things actually work. So I think the second one is more instructive. You observe what happens. And again, as I mentioned in my opening comments, I think that's where boards kind of get themselves in trouble, is they don't realize what they are training management up in by what they do rather than what the charters say they should do. And boards, I don't think necessarily spend enough time stepping back to say, well, what's predictable for us as a board? You take something like, let's say, I'll stick with a topical one, like changing health and safety regulation, where, you go back a few years ago, the requirements for directors were greatly elevated and enshrined in law or regulation, which is great. And now there's talk about potentially backing off on some of that. So it's predictable that boards, if you like, will go, oh my God, I've got personal responsibility now. So now I'm going to go to the nth degree to assure myself that we are running a safe and healthy and reliable operation. And I think that's why you've got to step back and say, actually, how much of that is identity driven? Like the story, I want to be seen as a professional, competent, capable director, versus actually what's fit for purpose for the company, and continually calibrate that.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting one, and it's one where I see a lot of directors struggle with. I say, well, I can't go out in the business because that's management stuff. I'll be interfering. So they actively stop them doing what you said is good practice to get out in the business because of that story.
I think the thing to explore there is actually, is that really what's true? Or you simply don't like to be in a situation, and I'll speak personally, where you're talking with a frontline worker who knows way more about it than you. There's a massive imbalance between authority or seniority, so it's kind of an awkward conversation. I've been in that, right? When you go and work with frontline teams, and you're the boss, they go, oh, who's the boss, 8 levels up or whatever it is, and you don't know what the heck it is really that they do. So I think if you're not careful, you end up, from an identity perspective, the story you have about yourself, you want to protect yourself. So your identity does that, and it creates a compelling logic why you should not go and do it. It says, actually, if you go out there as a director, you're a professional, capable person. Frankly, you might look like a bit of a dick in front of the frontline workers. So I'm going to protect you from that by saying the best thing for you to do is not overreach. So that's great logic. Like I shouldn't reach and undermine management. It's
Yeah.
your identity is really good at creating good reasons why you should not take action.
Mm.
Whereas what I've found to get over myself about that one is there is only one CEO. So how can I positively impact the front line? And sometimes just being present is good for them. And then all I ever did, because I'm not naturally a detailed DIY type guy, so health and safety is challenging for me. I was just really interested in what people did,
Mm.
and I was really interested in what I did that made their job harder. So imagine if you took that orientation as a director, like, yeah, I am willing to look a bit like a dick or feel a little bit awkward because this is really useful for the worker. And man, I get to understand how I make decisions and how that shows up for somebody who's on the end of a tool or facing a customer or anything like that. So that's what I've done with myself, is to say, okay, what's the really good reason for doing this? And frankly, who do I need to be? I need to be interested. I need to be inquiring. I need to be authentic in how I engage with workers, rather than I need to be professional, capable, and authoritative, because that gets me hung up on, this is going to be awkward.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because maybe if you look at behind the reason why people are doing it, they're doing it because I think they're supposed to do it.
Yeah.
Not doing it from what you said there, which is around curiosity, and actually, if I find out the things that are holding them back, could actually speed us up as a company, or improve engagement, or or reduce incidents, or whatever it is. So, and that, who do I need to be, is a really interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah, if you think that you're making these big decisions around capital allocation, your priorities for the quarter or for the year, risk management, or the level of risk you're willing to accept, it's just really good to get feedback or the experience from the people who directly face that. You can have this wonderful matrix around risks and beautiful beautiful bow ties, etc. But man, when you see a frontline worker who lives with that risk every day, I'll give you an example. I did a night shift in Zed's biofuels plant one night, and it's a relatively hazardous place. We've got all sorts of nasty chemicals there, and there's equipment working. And I tell you what, it's really scary. And there's only 3 of you on the shift. It's a big factory, if you like, or a big warehouse with a whole lot of kit that just makes noises. I didn't know whether those noises meant everything was working well, or we're on the cusp of blowing something up. So it's just really good for me anyway to understand what's that like, because most of us aren't at our best when we're doing a night shift. What's it like to be a worker in that situation where perhaps they've heard that they're not getting the capital this quarter or this year to do the repairs, not so much the repairs, but the preventive work that would make that a safer operating environment, because there's something else that was more of a priority. I just felt it was really good to go and experience that. So Zed, I worked in the biofuel plant, I refueled aircraft, I went out with truck drivers, because I felt it was really important that I understand what their world was like. So when I did make capital allocation, priority decisions, and risk decisions, at least I had some understanding of the real world rather than a PowerPoint deck.
Yeah, it's a great example. There's another question here. What suggestions does Mike have for the chair to demonstrate in action that truth-telling is valued and protected, especially when there is bad news?
Yeah, that's like the $300 million question, isn't it? So I think there's some things I think you can do preventively. What I mean by that is things you can do before that situation actually arises. So I think it's really important to talk about the behaviours we have as a board. Like, how do we want to deal with things? I think board only time can be really useful before you go into the meeting itself, where the directors might say, look, and I've done this. What's on the agenda today that's likely to amp any one of us up? Where do we think we need to tread warily? How do we create psychological safety? So before the agenda item comes up, the board have at least discussed how they're going to behave or show up during that situation. As I mentioned earlier, that notion of being balanced in how you review, for example, business cases, I think is a really good way to think about that as well. Is just don't unload your favorite question about, well, tell me, Gerry, how could this one go wrong? Some directors are just more wired to think about the downside than otherwise. I think for directors to own that for themselves, or at least for the chair to say, Mike, well, perhaps we'll go to Q&A, and Mike, why don't you kick us off, rather than perhaps I'm using you as the example, Gerry, if you're always first out of the blocks and it's always a downside question. So I do think that's how a chair can moderate things. I think that's particularly important. And yeah, I know this from my recent board experience, where you have, the boards get in the pattern where that there's always these one or two directors that will speak first. So I often will structure the conversation if it's a very tricky topic. So like, here's how we're going to have the conversation. I'm going to give everybody a chance to have a say, and it's going to be Mary, Sue, Gerry, and Mike will go in that order, and then each of you will be able to come back and query one another once everyone's had their say. So I think there are ways you can structure the conversation so that, particularly the more perhaps introverted or those that aren't necessarily as forthright in their opinions, they get to have their say, because I think sometimes those types of people start to have their say, and then, dare I mention it, that there's somebody else who's more forthright, more of an extrovert, just leaps over the top, say, yeah, but Gerry, we shouldn't have to worry about that. So I think that's part of what your role as the chair is. That's why I say you're more of a referee and coach, is just to make sure the game is well played, like from a process perspective, and then the scoreboard will take care of itself.
Yeah, and linked to that, so psychological safety is often discussed, in executive teams, but in a boardroom, how do you create enough safety for the honesty and vulnerability, but also enough edge for real challenge and for the challenge both in the board and between the board and the CEO?
Yeah, I think the chair certainly has a role an opportunity to role model that. I think certainly as chair, I tend to not have the first say. I encourage others. So as I said, I sort of coach the conversation rather than come out and say, I think this is a dog's breakfast. Now, what does anyone else have to think? So I think that's part of it. I think for in some directors will be more confident in this than others, but just to share your own authenticity. Like, I just find this a really challenging conversation. I know that our share price is down. We're under a lot of pressure. And therefore, I'm really mindful in how I ask questions about this business case in that context. So I think that one of the real strengths you can have at a team level is to talk about how things are showing up for you before you have the conversation. So I gave an example. If you had a set of results came in for the quarter, and they say you're down 10% year on year. For some people, that might occur or show up as being just the normal volatility we could or should expect. For someone else, it's absolute confirmation that our strategy is wrong. And for someone else, it might show up a different way. And then what you end up doing is you then discuss and debate various aspects of that. But often, because people haven't shared their context, at one level, you can't understand why someone else would have a different view to you. But if it shows up as being confirmation strategy's bad, if it shows up as being confirmation we need to spend more money on this part of the business that's down 10%, or it's just normal volatility, you can imagine the sort of, let's call it messy conversation that flows from those three interpretations of one thing, which is results are down, earnings are down 10% year on year. So I think that it's kind of like getting out, this shows up to me like a problem. This shows up to me like a challenge. This shows up to me like a risk. And then let's have the debate, I think can really help, because you can then explore why does it show up differently to one another, rather than argue about what you're suggesting we should or shouldn't do in response.
Right. So was that something you could do during board only time, is actually get that context from people, how they're coming into the meeting, what their context is, and then how do we want to show up, when the CEO comes in and presents his business case? Or
you could do, or you could just do it, actually in the meeting when management are in there. You might say, look, before we get into the guts of it, it's the actual topic itself. Let's just talk about how's this one showing up for you, Gerry? How's it showing up for you, Mike? Great. Now that that's on the table, let's then have the discussion. I went to the extent one time where, I was on a board where the board and management view of the world was like chalk and cheese. So you can imagine how effective that made conversations. So what I did is I said with the directors, we will write down the context as we see it. Here's our interpretation of where the company's at right now, how things are going, where we fit in the world, competitively, etc. And we got management to then, and I commend the management team for doing this. They went almost like line by line, paragraph by paragraph, and said, yes, yes, maybe, no, here's our view. So what that did, it made it really, really clear how we were interpreting things, which was at the heart of why we were having so many repeated disagreements. Oh, you see it as being, I don't know, a temporary blip in volatility. We see it as being something structural and strategic. No wonder we can't agree on what we should do about it.
Yeah.
It even is going to the extent of being as mechanical, and it was only 2 pages, but it might have been, you think about 2 pages, I don't know, 30 paragraphs, perhaps short paragraphs. It just meant, we could just go, right, we agree on that. We fundamentally have different views on that. Let's explore that rather than argue as we were about whether we should do more or less of something, because it's all contextual.
Yeah. And a question around what role, in terms of if the CEO is coming with a polished view of things, what's the role of the chair in that situation in terms of trying to get a bit more honesty and a bit more balance coming out? Because the CEO is obviously wants to impress, she wants to impress, and sometimes they put on the best view of things. So, and if that's if they're not giving everything in terms of downside as well as upside, and sometimes the board may drive that, but what's your experience of that?
Yeah, one of my colleagues went and actually did the director's course in Australia rather than the New Zealand one, just happened to be their preference. And they came back and I said to them, well, what was the most compelling thing you learned? And they said, well, the best tool a director has is a question. Right. So as opposed to a statement or an opinion or a point of view. So with that in mind, I think you could just ask questions that would help. At one level, you get assurance as a director that the CEO is not sort of just polishing the apple more than they really should, but equally help the CEO see what they maybe can't see. So you might say something like, well, what would be the view of a frontline worker around that? What would our customers be saying about that? Often, I know one of the particular questions I ask when a board gets to an answer really, really quickly, particularly on something really, really important, I say, look, just pause for a moment and explore what would cause us to regret this decision, right? Like everyone said yes, management came in strong and committed, the board heard it, and everyone got on board, and that took 5 minutes. That it could be the right answer, but actually, what would cause us to regret this? How would our competitor view this? And you like name the competitor. So I think using a question to open something up rather than saying, I disagree with you, Mike. How can you be so positive? Because the economy's down, negative GDP. That is likely to kick off what I would call an identity-led response from the person you're talking to, because they feel unconsciously like you're attacking them. You're questioning their professional judgment. So I think a question can just open up things in a more, not so much a gentle way, but in a way that's sufficiently pointed, but not personal.
Yeah.
Because that's part of what you have to get to. You have to be able to have debates about things, not personalities. And so often it ends up being you're attacking me as opposed to you're debating my idea.
Yeah. We had a little bit about questions before. What are the questions directors shouldn't ask, and what are the questions they should ask? So, in terms of the different types of questions.
Yeah.
Because I've seen some where there's like a gotcha question, trying to trap someone, or it's a question dressed up as a solution. Have you considered X?
Yeah.
And it's the director's view that they should be considering X. So what's the sort of do's and don'ts of good questions, that you would expect to see?
Yeah, so I think questions that help shift context are really good, like shift how it occurs. Now those could be things like risk. Risk questions are good because if you've got a management that is strong and this is a great business case, things are going well, this is all executable. Things like what are the 3 most important risks here? What are the things that are outside of our control? What are the dependencies that we're relying upon that aren't as explicit as they could be? So I think, questions that shift context, I think are really, really helpful. I think questions that attack identity are not helpful, but equally questions that open up how the person thinks about themselves, or indeed who do they need to be to execute this? And that could be a great question to ask. Like, okay, well, who do we need to be to execute this new strategy? Well, we need to be risk takers. We need to be tolerant of failure. And so, take an example, if you're a software company or say the chief product officer, and you come in and you're really proud of your impeccable record of shipping high quality code in well managed releases every time, and then someone else in the organization is saying, look, we just got to get stuff out there quicker, but more of a do learn do cycle, that's going to be really hard for you to say yes to. I'll give an example though. When Z did some of its first work around digital products and applications, we shipped some stuff. When I say we, I mean the innovation team shipped some stuff, the marketing team supported it, and then we got a bunch of feedback. And I had both groups coming to me. I had the marketing team coming to me screaming, saying, oh my God, we've got a whole ton of complaints. And I had the innovation team coming to me saying, this is fantastic. We've got so many ideas for improvement. Right? And that was exactly the same feedback. And I use the word feedback carefully. Some people heard a complaint and other people heard areas for improvement. So I think if you can ask questions that enable people to see where their identity, the story they have about themselves, like the marketers, which is we always do, like Zed, we're so committed to customers and the experience, we never want to have anything other than 100% quality. If that's the story they're living inside of, and the innovation team want to spend, in their own words, as little money as possible to learn as much as possible and ship it as quickly as possible, they are potentially in conflict. So the questions you ask could either surface that or inadvertently reinforce it. Like, why are you marketing people allowing customer service metrics to decline? Oh, it's the innovation team. Great, good answer, possibly true, but doesn't help the strategy around innovation.
Yeah. And I'll leave you with one last question, which is, if a board wanted to improve the quality of its decision over the next 90 days, what practical things would you suggest they change in how they prepare, meet, challenge, and follow up?
I would look over what have we done in the last 90 days and what has that reinforced, and what it reinforces, that really what we want. So like, an overly pessimistic view on risk, undermining management, not giving frontline workers enough say. Even something as simple as the agenda. If you say, oh, we're really committed to growth, and then all you do for the first half of the day is go through the usual compliance stuff. So by the after lunch session, we're already a bit worn out where we're going to a food coma, and now let's talk about growth or risk. That's what I would be examining. Or in other words, what conditions have we been creating over the last 90 days around governance that do not serve us well, and which ones do serve us well that we want to continue? And something as simple as the ordering of an agenda is really important, because it sends a signal. Innovation, it's kind of important, but we'll deal with that after lunch. But we'll be much more focused on compliance for the first half of the meeting. And that may be entirely appropriate if that's where you need to be. If you've got a strategy that says we need to be innovative, risk-taking, a little bit more bold than usual, but you don't change the order of the agenda, well, then you say one thing and you're inadvertently telling somebody the complete opposite. Yeah. It's all about creating the conditions. What conditions are we creating around governance, and is that what we really intended?
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Mike. So what I've taken out, really, I think one of the key things we started at the beginning was that 5-layer, going from results is what you get out. Actions lead to the results. Most people stop there. So if they're not getting what they want, they'll throw more actions to try and get different results. And your question of, if we execute 20% better, would that improve things? And if the answer is yes, then continue doing that. If it's not, then you go up to context. Are we clear on the context? Are we aligned on the context? Identity, who are we as a board or a leadership team? And then commitment. So that's a really interesting model, I think. I think the other part, just around that CEO chair relationship, is mutually understood context, which again aligns with that, which is really important, and commitment to each other. Um, I think the other part is, which some directors struggle with, is getting out in the business and not telling
Mm.
yourself the story that I'm going to tread on people's toes. It's if you want, you know, change that story to be how can I use that opportunity to improve the business, improve the culture, stop understand the barriers that may be in people's way. Um, and a good question is, what's predictable for us as a board if we continue doing what we're doing? So, whether that's the relationship with the management, whether that's how the board are working with each other. I think the other thing you talked about is behaviours we have as a board. So actually having a conversation about what are the behaviours that we want in this around this boardroom, so that they are explicit, not me assuming what those behaviours are, and you find that everyone's got a different set of behaviours, and using board only time to look at what's on the agenda and what could trigger you, or change how you show up as a board, and then
Mm.
actually how do we want to show up. So I think that was a really good one. Questions, I think, is really an important one that I see, is the types of questions you ask that open up the conversation, whether they're risk or opportunity based, but not to be solutions or attacking someone. And then just landing on the reflection. So really, if you want to improve, you've got to take the time to reflect. What have we done over the last 90 days? How has that impacted positively or negatively? And what do we need to do differently over the next 90 days? So I think there's some great provocations there, Mike, and really appreciate that. So I'd just like to thank you. I think it's been hugely valuable. I've learned a lot, and hopefully people on the call have learned a lot. Um, Thanks for making this practical, real, and very relevant. And thanks to everyone who's joined us today. 365, these are exactly the types of conversations we care about, helping boards and leadership teams really strengthen governance in a practical way. So we've got a few more exciting webinars coming up over the next few months. Thanks for everyone to being here. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we'd love to share what Govern 365 can do to help you. So thanks, Mike, once again, and have a great rest of your week. Thanks, everyone. See you next month.